In this video, I'm just going to go over information that just to give you a little more insight into parts of the PowerPoint that I want to make sure that you're clear on. So you're learning brain parts on your own. There's a PowerPoint on Blackboard. You have to be able to match the brain part with its function. This next section is the cranial nerves. There are technically 12 cranial nerves. You're going to have to learn only 6 of them, what they are and their function. These numbers up here are Roman numerals. They're represented by Roman numerals. And if we ever have lab again, when you look at the brains that are marked, you'll see little Roman numerals on the cranial nerves. So you need to know the first one, olfactory. You just need to know function. Okay, function is sense of smell. That one you should remember from lab. Again, you don't need to know the tests. That's just an extra. The optic is another one that you learned in lab. Obviously deals with vision. Okay. Ocular motor, if you look at the name, ocular motor, moving the eye, so eye movements. Actually, if you notice over here, just a side note, 3 of the 12 optic nerve, not 12 of the, sorry, 3 of the 12 cranial nerves actually deal with controlling your eye muscles, and that's because of the number of motor units it has, because remember how small they are. Vestibular cochlear deals with hearing and balance, okay, coming from your ear. The vagus nerve is the primary nerve of your parasympathetic nervous system. And if you look at this drawing, you will see it innervates, comes from your brain and innervates throughout all the organs. Remember we talked about parasympathetic being part of the autonomic nervous system, so the parts of your body that are automatically work without you having to think about them. Hypoglossal deals with tongue movements, and that's the ones you need to know. So the next section of the PowerPoint would go into the spinal cord. Spinal nerves, remember, are mixed nerves. All right. The one thing you need to know when we look at this here, if you remember the number of vertebrae you had, it was 7, 12, and 5, and the sacrum and the coccyx. Because of the anatomy, you'll notice that you have 8 cervical nerves, 12 and 5, 12 for thoracic, 5 for lumbar, but the key there is that you have an extra spinal nerve, not an extra one, but compared to the number of vertebrae, there is one more. This you should know from lab. We went through this. So the dorsal side, remember these are mixed nerves. Spinal nerves are mixed nerve. They contain both sensory and motor neurons. Then they branch, okay, into the roots. And then you have the dorsal root, which is sensory. You have the dorsal root ganglion, which is formed by the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. Here you have the ventral root. You don't have a ganglion here. This is the motor side because the cell bodies of motor neurons are located within the spinal cord. This is the gray matter, okay, gray matter. And then you remember you have the horns. So you have the dorsal horn and you have the ventral horn, or the posterior horn and the anterior horn. So again, sensory in the dorsal side into the horns here, and then you have the ventral horn, and then you have the ventral root. And then again, you have the spinal nerve. Remember the white matter tracts? We're going to talk about those in a little bit. Those are, they're white because they have the myelin sheath of the neurons that are coming to and from the brain. So again, review your lab material. That will help you with that section of the lecture. Okay. So this should just be review. Okay. Spinal nerves, again, are mixed. They each control a different area of the body. So dermatomes, and this probably is a new term for you. This is a map of the sensory portion of each spinal nerve. So when someone touches you on the shoulder right here, that means it would go in the sensory portion of the C4 nerve and then would head up to your brain where you would feel it. So the dermatomes are a map of the sensory portion of each spinal nerve. Reflexes you did in lab. We also talked about them in lecture before break, so make sure you know the parts of them. Okay, make sure you know the parts of them and a basic definition. Now, one thing we have not talked about in lecture or lab is the different tracks or the different pathways. So that we're talking specifically now about the white matter of the spinal cord. The white matter of the spinal cord is these tracks that go again up to or down from the brain. They're kind of like elevators, but they differ in the sense that these elevators only go one direction. So a descending pathway, which is a motor pathway, is going to start at your brain, go down your spinal cord, and then synapse out to muscles. An ascending pathway or sensory pathway is going to start out in the periphery, go into the spinal cord, then up an elevator or up a tract, an ascending pathway to the part of the brain that allows you to feel, have touch, pain, pressure, and so on. So these are pathways. Now, here's a picture of a pathway, and here's the questions that you need to be able to answer. This is going to be an in-class. This is going to be an in-class case study, which obviously now we're not going to do. So what I'm going to do is go through and answer these questions for this. So if you look at this, you will see the arrows are going down. So that is a descending pathway, which means it's going to start in the brain, go down the spinal cord, synapse out, and then go out. This is a motor pathway. Descending pathways that start at the brain and go down are motor pathways or descending pathways. Now the question here, oops, sorry, wrong way. What kind of track? So a descending or a motor pathway. What lobe of the brain does the signal for this begin? You need to go back and think about, I'm going to give you the answer, but you need to go back and think about what part of the brain. And so the motor cortex is located in the frontal lobe. So every voluntary movement you make starts at that frontal lobe, in the back of the frontal lobe in the motor cortex. So not the prefrontal cortex, but the motor cortex in the back of the frontal lobe is where this originates from. And then it's going to head down. Again, this is voluntary movement. Then it's going to head down. And it's asked you then, what horn does the signal leave the spinal cord? Well, this shows me whether you understand the horns or not when you get down to the spinal cord portion. So here you have the spinal cord, and here you have the dorsal side. Look for that dorsal root ganglia. Here you have the ventral side. So what you'll see, remember the ventral side is the motor side, that it's going to leave the ventral or anterior horn. Okay, ventral or anterior horn. And then what kind of neuron is going to take the information from the spinal cord to the muscle? It is a motor pathway, so it's going to be a motor neuron. A motor neuron. Okay, so let's do this again. Descending pathway, starting at the motor cortex in the frontal lobe. It leaves the ventral or anterior horn. A motor neuron is what's going to take the signal from the spinal cord to the muscle. And the last question, if the muscle movement takes place on the right side of the body, which side of the brain did the signal originate? Most of you know that, probably from previous background, but you'll notice here, you'll see it come down and then you will see it cross over. So the signal to move the right foot, for example, is going to come from the left side of the brain and vice versa. So here you can see the crossing over that occurs down that descending pathway. So that is a descending pathway. If you need to, go back and listen to what I just went over again, take some notes to make sure you understand it. Okay, now we're going to look at an ascending pathway, and we have this set of questions. What type of tract, what type of neuron, what route, and so on. So we'll go back and forth again. Here you have a person who for some reason is putting a match to their foot. And what's going to happen is a sensory neuron, because we're going from the periphery to the central. A sensory neuron is going to take that information through the dorsal root, right, into the dorsal or posterior horn. Okay. You will then see that it crosses over, and then it's going to head up. That's an ascending pathway. It's going to head up to the brain. You'll see that there's a synapse here, and then you'll see it goes to a different part of the brain. So which root of the spinal cord did the neuron enter? It entered the dorsal root. Now this is a sensory signal. So if you go back to your brain parts, one of the things you will learn is the thalamus is a relay station. So a relay station, if the signal's going to head up there, and then the thalamus is going to decide, first of all, whether it's important enough to send the signal on. And then if it does, it's going to send it to the sensory cortex of the parietal lobe. And if that does not ring a bell, then you need to go back again and go through those brain parts and their functions. So we're going to do an ascending pathway, starts with a sensory neuron going through the dorsal root and the dorsal horn. Notice it crosses over, Synapses starts to go up. It's going to go to the thalamus first, and then it's going to head to the sensory cortex, which is in the parietal lobe, and it's actually right behind the motor cortex. So it's the motor cortex in the frontal lobe and the sensory cortex in the parietal lobe. The last question, if the sensation was felt on the right foot, what side of the brain did the signal end up in? And again, that crossing over, it starts on your right foot and then would end up on the left side of the brain and vice versa. Okay, so this is just information to help you. Again, people say, oh, it's hard to learn on video. Actually, the advantage you have is that you can rewind me and listen to me like forever if you have nothing better to do. So go back, take some notes, make sure you can answer these questions for each of the pathways that we talked about. And again, if I went too fast for you, you go back and rewind and make sure you can answer them. Okay, that's it for now.